In the bitter winter of 1697, a discovery was made that Salem village would never truly recover from. Beneath the creaking floorboards of a modest wooden home, 17 bodies were found hidden in the frozen earth. Each one bore the same haunting signature, a clean surgical cut across the throat, wrists and ankles bound with hemp rope, knotted in deliberate, almost ceremonial patterns and strange symbols carved into their foreheads with the precision of a sharpened medical blade. Even the most seasoned colonial physicians were shaken. These were not the clumsy marks of rage or accident. This was knowledge anatomy used as a weapon. Knowledge that in the wrong hands became something far darker. By nightfall, every scrap of evidence was seized, records sealed, witness accounts confiscated. And with a kind of desperate determination, the authorities erased one name from history itself: Prudence Fairweather. For over 3 centuries, her existence was deliberately omitted from official ledgers, court transcripts, and parish sermons. Yet, the whispers never died. The story passed quietly from one generation to the next, never spoken too loudly, never written down for long. Because what was uncovered in that house threatened the very foundation of Puritan belief that evil always came from outside, never from within. Friends, before we go further into Prudence Fairweather's story, before we begin to unravel the chilling path that led to those 17 bound souls, pause for a moment. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. And if you're ready for a tale that will pull at the very seams of colonial America, make sure you subscribe. Because stories like this, stories history tried to bury, are why we gather here. To understand how a woman like Prudence could thrive undetected, we must step back and look at Salem village itself in 1697. This was a community, scarred and fragile, a place already fractured by fear. Only 8 miles inland from bustling Salem town, the village was home to about 600 people. 600 souls living under relentless scrutiny. Religious pressure weighed on every decision, economic hardship pinched every household, and the shadow of the infamous witch trials loomed heavily. After all, only 5 years earlier, 25 people had already been executed in the fever of hysteria. The land itself mirrored the darkness of their lives. Salem village was hemmed in by vast forests of oak pine and maple trees so dense that even midday light felt muted, a perpetual twilight pressing down on the settlement. And in those woods lurked dangers. Very real wolves, bears, and native tribes who understandably viewed the English settlers' expansion as a direct threat to their survival. These constant dangers hardened the villagers. They clung to each other, distrusted outsiders, and at the same time, desperately needed anyone who could help ensure survival through brutal winters. This tension made fertile ground for someone who knew how to exploit fear, someone like Prudence. The village itself was little more than 45 simple wooden homes clustered around a central green. At the heart of it stood the meeting house, stark and looming, where Reverend Samuel Parris thundered through his fire and brimstone sermons every Sunday twice a day, reminding his flock of hellfire waiting at every turn. Each house was rough-hewn, built from logs and boards, their steeply pitched roofs designed to shed the heavy snows that could trap families inside for weeks. Smoke curled endlessly from stone chimneys, filling the air with the mingled scents of burning wood, boiled stews, and something more intangible. The thick presence of prayers whispered and shouted alike from a people desperate for redemption, or at least protection from the sins they feared lurked within themselves. The social order of Salem village in the late 17th century was strict, almost suffocating, defined as much by Puritan theology as by simple necessity. At the very top stood the great farming families, the Putnams, the Coreys, whose vast holdings of land gave them both wealth and political weight. Beneath them labored the skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths hammering out nails and plows, carpenters shaping timber for homes, millers grinding the grain, and weavers spinning cloth. These men and women were not rich, but their skills made them indispensable. And at the bottom, left vulnerable and often judged, were the widows, the unmarried, the laborers, and the recent arrivals who depended on charity or the grudging goodwill of the neighbors just to survive. Into this delicate and precarious hierarchy stepped Prudence Fairweather. It was the autumn of 1692, the very moment the witch trial hysteria had begun its slow, exhausted collapse. The community was still raw, still tense, and still whispering of devils. And then she arrived, 32 years old, calling herself a widow, traveling alone. All she owned fit into a single wagon plane, clothing household necessities, and an extraordinary chest of gleaming medical instruments unlike anything most villagers had ever seen. From the moment she appeared, Prudence carried herself with the calm authority of someone useful, someone educated. She told anyone who asked the same story her husband Jeremiah had perished of fever while traveling from Providence Plantation in Rhode Island. She produced papers to prove it, marriage certificate, death record, signed by a physician, even letters of recommendation from ministers vouching for her character and praising her medical skills. Later, those documents would be exposed as clever forgeries, but at the time, they were more than convincing. They gave her legitimacy. And in a society desperate for knowledge and healing, that was all she needed. Prudence looked every bit the part she intended to play. Slightly taller than most women of her day, her frame was slender yet strong, suited to long hours of labor. Her eyes were her most striking feature, pale washed-out blue that in certain light seemed almost colorless. Some said those eyes calmed them. Others confessed they found them unsettling, as though Prudence could see more than she admitted. Her hair, prematurely gray, was always tucked neatly beneath a spotless white cap. It never seemed to soil, not even after days of medical work. And then there were her hands, steady, precise, with long fingers that moved like instruments themselves. She could prepare remedies, stitch wounds, or guide a laboring mother with equal ease. Villagers remarked on her gentle touch, though a few admitted uneasily that her skin felt oddly cold, a chill not explained by winter or by frailty. Still, Salem village needed her. Out on the colonial frontier, medical knowledge was scarce and often unreliable. Births were attended by elderly women, armed only with memory and prayer. A serious wound or fever could mean death within days. Prudence's practiced knowledge, her remedies for infection, her skill in complicated births, her herbs gathered and catalogued with care, seemed like an answer to desperate prayers. She rented a modest but sturdy home from Ezekiel Horn, a distant cousin of Judge John Hathorne, the very man who had presided over the infamous witch trials. The house stood alone, shrouded in a grove of ancient elms whose bare branches, in winter, created a natural screen, hiding whatever happened within. It was a single-room structure with a steep wooden ladder leading to a sleeping loft. Prudence quickly hung blankets to partition the space, creating one corner for cooking, another for her bed, and a third for what she described as her medical practice. Her furnishings were simple, but practical, collected bit by bit, from neighbors and passing merchants. Yet what drew every eye and every whispered curiosity was her collection of instruments. Knives of unusual sharpness, forceps and clamps, saws polished to a gleam. Tools meant for surgery, tools that spoke of knowledge far beyond that of the average midwife. Now pause with me for a moment. Imagine being a villager in that time, desperate for help, wary of strangers, but staring at a woman who seemed to carry both salvation and something inexplicably unnerving in her hands. Would you have trusted her, or would you have felt the faint chill that others dared not speak aloud? Prudence's instruments were not simply tools of her trade, they were treasures. She kept them in a specially built wooden case, lined with deep velvet, and she tended to them with an almost obsessive devotion. Hours each week were spent cleaning, sharpening and polishing until each blade gleamed like glass, each edge capable of cutting with surgical precision. Villagers who caught sight of her case spoke of it in hushed tones. It seemed out of place in a frontier village, almost too refined, too specialized, like something that belonged in a great city hospital rather than in the rough woods of New England. In her first months in Salem village, Prudence did everything she could to present herself as more than a physician. She became a model Puritan, never missing Sunday services, always arriving early, and lingering afterward to speak with Reverend Paris and the elders. Her command of scripture astonished those who listened. Whole chapters rolled from her tongue, effortlessly recited from memory. She could weave complex points of doctrine into conversation as easily as a minister. And more than once, she offered interpretations that struck even the most devout as wise and comforting. But beyond her knowledge, Prudence understood something deeper. The community was still wounded, still broken by the witch trials. Fear lingered in the air, like smoke after a fire. She spoke about the dangers of false accusations, about forgiveness, about healing in the wake of hysteria. And her words soothed. They were exactly what Salem village longed to hear. It was not long before many saw her as a voice of reason in a place that had nearly destroyed itself with suspicion and guilt. And then on February 14th, 1693, the illusion of safety cracked. That night, one of the worst winter storms in memory battered the settlement. When morning came, Margaret Kennan, a 45-year-old widow, was missing. Margaret was no wanderer. Since the death of her husband Robert, killed by wolves, the summer before, she had thrown herself into her faith with strict discipline. Her routines were exact. Morning prayers, afternoon spinning or garden work, evening services. Always punctual, always predictable, which made her disappearance all the more unsettling. Her neighbor Elizabeth Proctor went to check on her when she failed to appear at morning prayers. What she found chilled her to the bone. Margaret's cottage stood empty, silent cold. The fire in the hearth had long since died, leaving only grey ash. A simple meal sat untouched on the wooden table. The bed was unslept and perfectly neat. It was as if she had vanished between one breath and the next. A search party formed quickly. Experienced woodsmen traced her path from the meeting house to her home, but the snow erased almost everything. Still faint footprints were found. They led toward a stand of pine trees and then ended abruptly, swallowed by the storm. There was no sign of struggle, no trail leading away. Nothing. Nothing except for one object. Beneath a pine tree, they found Margaret's prayer book. It was not dropped or cast aside, it was placed. Open carefully to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. And though it had lain in the snow through the storm, the pages were almost untouched, as if shielded from the wind. Prudence Fairweather threw herself into the search with unmatched energy. She walked the frozen woods for hours, calling Margaret's name with such earnest anguish that villagers whispered about her compassion. She organized prayer vigils, brewed hot soup for the exhausted men, even examined bits of cloth and footprints with what seemed like a physician's careful eye. Her grief appeared genuine, her voice trembling as she told the villagers, "Sister Margaret is surely in God's hands now. We must pray that her soul finds peace, whether in this world or the next. The Lord often calls His most faithful servants home in ways that are beyond our mortal understanding." For a community desperate to make sense of a faithful woman's sudden disappearance, Prudence's words felt like balm. Many repeated them to each other in the days that followed, clinging to her calm interpretation as though it could steady their own fear. But friends, I want you to pause with me here. Imagine you were in that village. Would you have felt comforted by Prudence's words, or would you have noticed what a few quietly admitted later, that her presence at the heart of every search, her voice in every prayer seemed just a little too perfect? The belief that God Himself had called Margaret away to some higher purpose became the explanation most villagers clung to. It was far less terrifying than the alternative that something human, something hidden among them, had taken her. But 3 weeks later, on March 8, 1693, that fragile comfort shattered again. Thomas Bridgman, a young carpenter of 22, vanished without a trace. Thomas was not careless. He was known for his reliability, his steady hand, his caution. At the time, he was repairing storm damage in the nearby hamlet of Topsfield. Each day, he left Salem village early and returned before dusk, avoiding the forest after dark. On the day he disappeared, Thomas finished work earlier than expected. He set off home in broad daylight, giving himself hours of safety before sunset. Yet, he never arrived. When night fell, his mother Sarah alerted the constables. A search party followed the familiar path through the woods, and about a mile outside Salem village, they found the first clue: his carpenter's bag. It had been torn open, its contents scattered across the snow. Most of the tools were there, but some of the more valuable items, including a set of precision chisels gifted to him by his late father, were missing. And then there was something stranger still. Hanging from a branch 20 feet off the path was Thomas's coat. It was not torn, not dirtied, not ripped away in struggle. It had been placed there. Inside the pocket, the searchers found a note in Thomas's handwriting. "Going to help someone in need? Don't worry." But his family was adamant Thomas would never abandon his tools, his livelihood, for a stranger. The vague, almost careless phrasing of the note sounded nothing like him. No one in Topsfield or Salem reported requesting his help. No other travelers were seen on the path that day. The message only deepened the mystery. Once again, Prudence Fairweather was at the center of the search. She sat with Sarah Bridgman holding her hand through long nights of prayer, preparing special herbal teas that seemed to calm her grief. She organized search parties with almost military precision, earning the admiration of the constables. To Sarah she whispered, "The Lord works in mysterious ways." Perhaps Thomas was called to serve a higher purpose we cannot yet understand. We must trust in divine providence and pray that he is safe in God's care. Her words brought tears and strange comfort. With each tragedy, Prudence's place in the community deepened. She became not only their healer, but their counselor, their interpreter of God's mysterious will. By the summer of 1693, the disappearances could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. One by one, more villagers slipped away. Rebecca Noyes, a young mother of 3, disappeared on the road to her sister's home in a neighboring settlement. Her body was never found, but her silver locket, a cherished heirloom she never removed, was discovered dangling from a branch miles off her intended path. Samuel Noyes, Rebecca's elderly father-in-law and a respected church elder, vanished weeks later while tending his livestock. His family found the barn doors ajar, several animals missing, but no signs of theft. Only his walking stick remained abandoned in the forest, its wood carved with strange symbols no villager recognized. Then Jonathan Prescott, the blacksmith, disappeared while traveling to Salem town to buy iron for his forge. His horse returned alone reins, dragging in the dirt, carrying a letter supposedly written by Jonathan. The message claimed he had decided to seek his fortune in Boston, never to return. But friends, pause with me here. Imagine this string of vanishings in your own small town. First the widow, then the carpenter, then the mother, the elder, the blacksmith. Each case explained away with words like God's will or he chose to leave. Would you have accepted those explanations? Or would you have begun to suspect, as some villagers secretly did, that something or someone was orchestrating a pattern too dark to ignore? The handwriting in Jonathan Prescott's letter may have resembled his own, but the voice within it was alien, formal, stilted, strangely pious. It was not the blacksmith his friends had known. And then came more vanishings. Mary Corey, a seamstress, celebrated across the region for her exquisite embroidery, went missing while gathering berries in the woods behind a family farm. Her basket was found empty, balanced carefully on a fallen log, like a deliberate marker left behind. Even stranger, several pieces of her embroidery were discovered hanging from the branches of nearby trees. Bright thread against dark bark, arranged almost like a grim gallery. Who had placed them there? And why? Not long after 16-year-old Elizabeth Ward disappeared. She was delivering flour for her family's mill, a simple errand she had done countless times. Yet, at a crossroads, her cart was discovered abandoned, the sacks of flour stacked neatly on the ground beside it. A note was pinned to one bag claiming Elizabeth had chosen to leave and join a religious sect in Connecticut. But her parents swore she had never spoken of such a thing. She was barely more than a child. Do you see the pattern? Each disappearance carried the same disturbing marks: a person vanishing while alone. Belongings left behind as though staged, and always a note. The handwriting appeared genuine, but the words were not. Formal, almost sermon-like, always circling around themes of God-divine service or spiritual calling. Words that sounded less like the missing villagers and more like someone else. At first, explanations were simple. Wolves, bears, or perhaps raids from neighboring tribes. But animals do not hang coats on trees. They do not pin notes to flour sacks. and raids leave violence evidence fire. Here there was only silence. Reverend Samuel Parris, already haunted by the stain of the witch trials 5 years earlier, seized the moment from his pulpit. His sermons grew darker, more fearful. Evil does not always announce itself with thunder and brimstone, he thundered. Sometimes it comes disguised as righteousness, whispering prayers while concealing the blackest of intentions. His eyes raked the congregation with the same fire that had once condemned neighbors to the gallows. And in a community still scarred from those trials, fear found fertile soil. Suspicion spread like frost across the village, numbing, reason-feeding hysteria. And yet, amid this growing terror, one woman's star only shone brighter. Prudence Fairweather. She was always there at the right moment, soothing, guiding, feeding. When grief overwhelmed the villagers, she appeared with prayer and comfort. When sickness spread from fear, she brought herbs and remedies. She gathered the families of the missing into her own home twice each week for what she called her prayer circle. There the broken found solace, the doubtful found reassurance. In their darkest hour, she became their healer, their shepherd. But it was in one of those very gatherings in late August that the first crack appeared in her perfect mask. The group was kneeling in prayer inside Prudence's dimly lit home. As voices murmured psalms, Martha Corey, the sister of the missing seamstress Mary, bowed her head low. Her gaze drifted almost by accident to the far wall of the room. There, soaking into the wooden floorboards, she saw it. Dark stains, stains that no amount of prayer could explain away. And friends, pause here with me. Imagine yourself in Martha's place, surrounded by grieving families, their hands clasped in devotion, while your eyes catch sight of something sinister beneath the feet of the very woman leading their prayers. Would you speak up, or would you hold your tongue terrified of what truth might come to light? The stains, Martha realized, weren't old. They looked recent, dark, tacky, as though liquid had seeped into the same patch of floorboards again and again, soaking deeper each time. The summer had been unusually dry, yet these marks remained disturbingly fresh. After the meeting, she gathered her courage and mentioned her observation to Prudence. The reaction was instantaneous, though fleeting. Prudence's pale blue eyes sharpened with a flicker of intensity, so quick most would have missed it. Then, in her familiar gentle tone, she smiled. "The work of healing is not always clean, Sister Martha," she said softly. "Blood from tending wounds from childbirth, from the preparation of remedies, it lingers. The Lord's mercy sometimes requires us to walk through suffering before we may deliver salvation." Her voice remained calm, even soothing, but Martha caught something beneath the words, a cold calculation that made her skin prickle. To the others, the explanation was perfectly reasonable. A healer's home would surely bear such traces. But Martha could not let go of the unease curling in her chest. The inconsistencies became clearer the more she paid attention. Prudence claimed sleepless nights aiding the sick and delivering infants, yet she was always immaculate, well-rested, her complexion untouched by exhaustion. Her medical supplies never seemed to dwindle, no matter how often she claimed to use them. And though she worked mostly for donations, her household showed signs of wealth: fabrics, spices, and tools beyond the reach of most villagers. By the time autumn cloaked the Massachusetts wilderness in crimson and gold colors that looked far too much like blood to those already uneasy, a dreadful pattern had begun to take shape, driven by the memory of her sister Mary's embroidery, dangling from tree branches like a macabre display, and by the vision of those dark stains, Martha began her own quiet investigation. She documented every disappearance with a precision that bordered on obsession. She sought out the families of the missing, pressing them gently for details. Their loved ones' last known movements, their recent worries, their private confessions. What she uncovered chilled her. Each vanished soul bore the same hidden marks of guilt, or at least what the Puritan mind considered guilt. Margaret Kenston, the widow, had spoken too warmly with a traveling merchant. She had also questioned God's justice after her husband's violent death, questions she had whispered to Prudence during counseling. Thomas Bridgman the carpenter had been caught with rum behind the meeting house and had worked on the Sabbath sins that marked him as unreliable. He too had spoken with Prudence before he vanished. Rebecca Noyes, the young mother, had given birth a little too soon after marriage, fueling whispers of impropriety. Shamed, she had turned to Prudence for comfort. Her father-in-law, Samuel Noyes, had been accused of cheating his neighbors with false weights, never formally charged, but guilty in the court of rumor. He also had visited Prudence troubled by conscience. Jonathan Prescott, the blacksmith, was known to work on the Sabbath, claiming his forge was indispensable. He had even been accused of overcharging during times of need. He too had been seen in Prudence's company. Marie Corey, Martha's own sister, had been accused of vanity, her embroidery deemed prideful worldly, unfit for a godly woman. She had turned to Prudence uncertain whether her talents were sin or blessing, and young Elizabeth Ward, barely 16, had been seen walking with a boy. Without a chaperone, a scandal in Puritan eyes. She too had been counseled by Prudence. Every missing soul, Martha realized, had two things in common. First, they carried some mark of moral weakness. And second, each had confided in Prudence Fairweather before vanishing. Friends, pause here with me. Imagine being Martha. Your own sister gone, your neighbors vanished, and all trails leading back to the one woman everyone else saw as saintly savior. Do you speak the truth? Risk being branded mad, or worse, a witch? Or do you stay silent, knowing that silence itself might feed the predator in your midst? Elizabeth Ward's secret walks with the young man had already been discovered by her parents. Ashamed and fearful for her reputation, she was sent to Prudence for guidance on how a young Christian woman ought to conduct herself. Another troubled soul seeking spiritual counsel. Another thread in the growing web Martha was slowly unraveling. By now the pattern was undeniable. One by one, Martha laid the evidence bare before her own eyes. Every missing villager had been marked in some way as spiritually compromised. And each had confided in Prudence Fairweather, receiving from her not only counsel, but what seemed like a form of absolution. Absolution she had no right to grant. Martha shared these discoveries with her husband Giles. To the outside world, Giles was a grizzled farmer, scarred and quiet. But to Martha, he was a man who had endured horrors few could imagine, pressed to death beneath crushing stones during the witch trials of 1692, punished for refusing to confess to a crime he did not commit. He had survived the ordeal, but not without scars on his body and his spirit. So when Martha whispered her suspicions about Prudence, Giles recoiled. He had lived the consequences of false accusation. He knew better than anyone how fear could twist neighbors into executioners. But as Martha's evidence grew tidy, notes left behind personal belongings arranged with care, each disappearance linked to Prudence's counsel, even Giles, reluctant as he was, began to admit the truth. This was not the work of spirits, nor the random cruelty of wolves or strangers. This was human, calculated, planned. Together they expanded the investigation, quietly seeking allies. Their first came in Sarah Bridgman, the grieving mother of Thomas, the vanished carpenter. At first, Sarah had sung Prudence's praises, grateful for the healer's comfort. But as weeks passed, troubling details gnawed at her. For all her supposed experience, Prudence sometimes revealed an awkwardness in speaking of anatomy. Her knowledge felt learned from books not honed by years of practice. And she had displayed an unusual curiosity about Thomas's life, his daily habits, his private thoughts, his future plans. Even more unsettling, Prudence had spoken with uncanny precision about Thomas's last day alive. She knew he had finished his work early, had been in good spirits, and that he intended to buy new tools. These were details shared only within his family. How could Prudence have known? Martha and Giles pressed further, and soon new cracks appeared. A disturbing pattern of missing valuables came to light. Thomas's wages, Rebecca Noyes's silver heirloom, Jonathan Prescott's hidden store of coin. All gone, never recovered. And yet, Prudence had acquired new furniture, costly medical instruments, and had even given large charitable donations to the church. Where did her wealth truly come from? Her very history, when examined, began to crumble. The letters of recommendation she carried allegedly from Providence Plantation proved worthless. None there had ever heard of Prudence or her late husband, Jeremiah. Ministers she claimed as mentors denied knowing her. And those medical tools she wielded, so confidently intricate surgical instruments, were not the kind owned by midwives or backwoods healers. They were the tools of physicians from Boston or Philadelphia, men of training and wealth. How then had she come to possess them? And then, as the year turned and winter set in, something strange happened. The vanishings ceased. Snow buried Salem village for 4 long months, sealing its people in cold and silence. For a time it seemed as though the shadow that had haunted them had finally passed. And during that brutal season, Prudence shone brighter than ever in the villagers' eyes. She organized food relief, saving families from starvation. She led prayers through the longest, bleakest nights, her voice a balm against despair. She delivered 3 children into the world when their mothers might have perished, and she nursed the sick back to health with remedies that worked. It was as though the healer truly was what she claimed to be, a servant of God, chosen to bring mercy in their time of trial. But Martha could not forget the stains, the lies, the disappearances. And so I ask you, friends, what would you have done? In a village that owed its survival to this woman, would you dare to whisper suspicion against her? Or would you bury your doubts beneath the snow, praying that the spring thaw would not bring evil, walking once more? Prudence's success in the harsh winter made the village look to her as a pillar of survival. To many, she was tangible proof that God had blessed them. Even the most skeptical began to soften. How could anyone condemn a woman who had saved babies and fed hungry families, but not Martha Corey? The more she watched Prudence being celebrated, the more her heart boiled. During the long winter nights when snow blocked the roads and only the flickering light of the stove could be seen, Martha quietly investigated. She interviewed each family that had lost a member, carefully recording each story and every detail. And what she discovered made Martha shudder. It turned out that before they disappeared, all the victims had met with Prudence in so-called spiritual counseling sessions. She led them in prayer, fasting, and purification rituals that no one in the village had ever heard of in the Bible. Each victim spoke of a special blessing, a promise that they would be protected from evil, chosen to serve God in a way that no ordinary believer could attain. But most frightening of all, in her counseling sessions, Prudence probed for details. She asked about her family, her routine, her possessions, her secret fears. At the time, it seemed like she wanted to heal her soul. But in the light of truth, Martha realized Prudence was building a profile of each of her prey, who could easily disappear without being noticed, who had valuable assets, who had a weakness that could allow them to forge a last will. It was not random. It was not a whim. It was planned. This was an organized hunter. The spring of 1694 came, and the villagers breathed a sigh of relief, hoping to sow seeds in the fields that had just thawed. But that hope was quickly dashed. Within a short week, 2 people had disappeared. This time, even the most hardened of hearts would have found it hard to believe that it was just a random tragedy. On April 12th, Jacob Putnam, a young farmer who was deeply in debt, left his village at dawn carrying some dry provisions and a few valuables. He intended to find work in Salem town to pay off his debts and restore his honor. But he never made it. Jacob's satchel was found neatly abandoned beside a familiar rock on the trail. Inside was a letter. Jacob's handwriting, of course, but the content completely unfamiliar. God has called me to serve in the work of cleansing souls. I go to prepare with His chosen people for His kingdom. Do not mourn for me, for I have been granted the highest salvation. Those words. Jacob, a poor farmer who only wanted to pay off his debts and keep a roof over his wife and children's heads, would never have said them. His wife Hannah insisted that her husband had never had any lofty ideas about purification or divine mission. He was only concerned with food and clothing. So who wrote those words with his hand? 5 days later, Ruth Willard disappeared. Ruth was a single woman in her 40s, spinning and weaving. Her greatest crime, being caught by Reverend Paris reading English poetry, a legacy of her late aunt. In a community where the Bible was the only book allowed to be read, such an act was considered to nourish the soul in frivolous, even dangerous things. And Ruth, like so many before her, sought out Prudence. The 2 disappearances so close together like 2 stabs tore apart the illusion of peace that had just returned. And now I want to ask you, who are following this story, if you had lived in Salem that spring, what would you have done? Believed in Prudence, the winter savior, or stand by Martha, daring to dig for the truth even when the whole village wants to turn away? The discovery of the poetry books in Ruth Willard's house was a minor scandal. But in Puritan society, it was enough to brand a person's soul with guilt. After a humiliating public confession and mandatory spiritual counseling, Ruth disappeared on her way to deliver a set of sheets in exchange for some money to survive the winter. Her body was never found. All that remained, the sheets neatly folded, laid out by the path, and a letter. The letter, written in Ruth's handwriting, could not have come from her mind. The language was too lofty, talking about purification and a form of salvation beyond the ordinary Christian ideas that a lone working woman who spun and wove could never have uttered. Jacob, then Ruth. Both had frequented Prudence's house. Both had spoken of her mysterious teachings. And both disappeared, leaving behind evidence laid out with cold precision. At this point, even the most stubborn could not deny evil was in human form, not the wrath of God. But who would dare point the finger at Prudence? She had become Salem's untouchable savior. An accusation without evidence was tantamount to signing a hanging warrant. And the memory of the witch trials still scarred the villagers' minds, making them wary of any voice calling for punishment by speculation. In the shadows, a small alliance formed. Martha, Corey, Giles. Corey and Sarah Bridgman. They met in secret places, whispering as they pieced together the horrifying picture. When Timothy, Corey, Martha's nephew, volunteered as Prudence's assistant, the truth became clearer. He described the strange stench from behind the curtain, the muffled sounds from under the floor, and the locked chest filled with the personal effects of those who had disappeared. When Timothy dared to mention it, Prudence changed her mask. No more gentleness, no more comfort, only a snake-like hiss. There are works of God that mortal minds cannot understand. Whoever dares to question them will be damned forever. The boy fled, carrying the living evidence with him. But the secret alliance was at a dead end. To oppose Prudence was to oppose the whole village. And Prudence, as if reading their minds, began to insert warnings about false prophets into their public prayers, sowing seeds of doubt in everyone's ears. Then tragedy struck. 3 more disappeared. Benjamin Nurse, who had dared to criticize Prudence's influence. Abigail Foster, the only one who publicly refused spiritual counseling. And finally, the final blow. Deacon Edward Putnam, one of the secret investigators. Edward disappeared in his own house, leaving behind a letter volunteering to serve the purification. With that disappearance, the alliance lost its most trusted voice and realized that this was not just a predatory game, but a direct warning. After Edward's social death, Prudence suddenly stopped hiding. She held mass rituals all night, turning the crowd into fanatics, excited by the new salvation. Martha watched and noticed something terrible. The most enthusiastic people in those rituals disappeared one by one within a few weeks. The final turning point came on a cold December night in 1696. Giles Corey, a chronic insomniac, often wandered the dark streets of the village in the pre-dawn hours. That night, he caught sight of a faint light coming from behind Prudence's curtains. His instincts urged him to approach, and through a small gap in the wooden shutters, he saw a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Prudence stood in a circle of candles, calmly cutting strips of flesh from a human body on the treatment table. Her movements were not those of a physician, but those of a skilled butcher. What was most horrifying, she was softly humming hymns, her icy blue eyes reflecting the candlelight as if they were no longer human. The flesh was carefully wrapped in white cloth stored in a chest with jewelry and clothes, all in a ritual that had been repeated countless times. Giles quietly retreated, but the truth he had just witnessed was like poison spreading through his mind. The woman the whole village worshipped as a healing goddess was actually a predator in the guise of an angel using her faith to trap her prey. When Martha and Sarah heard Giles's story, they understood that they finally had evidence, but there was no safe way to bring it to light. Especially when Prudence began to pay unusual attention to Martha. She repeatedly came to the Corey farm whispering, "Sister Martha, I feel a storm inside you that is threatening your soul. Let me pray and cleanse you." Martha firmly refused, but that only made Prudence more persistent and dangerous. Everything fell apart when Sarah Bridgman disappeared after agreeing to meet Prudence to find the final answer about her son Thomas. That disappearance was the last straw. In the midst of a terrible February blizzard, Giles and Martha risked their lives to break into Prudence's home while she was delivering a baby at Willard Farm. What they found beneath the floorboards was beyond belief. 17 bodies in various stages of decomposition, lying in shallow pits, all with identical throat cuts, bound hands, and incomprehensible marks carved into their foreheads. Evidence suggested that many of the victims had been kept alive for hours in agony before being killed. In a locked chest, they found a grisly collection locks of hair, bloody rags, and a notebook detailing the victims' final moments. There was even an entry about Sarah Bridgman. The Bridgman woman resisted remarkably remaining conscious for nearly 6 hours during the purification. Her longing for her son was her last whisper, unaware that she had been saved by me many months before. With such incontrovertible evidence, Martha and Giles immediately alerted the Salem town authorities. Prudence was arrested on February 18, 1697, while leading a prayer circle. Her response was chilling. No fear, no remorse, just cold satisfaction. "Every soul I take is tainted with sin," she declared. "I give them purification by suffering as Christ brought salvation through suffering. Their death is a grace." Prudence's trial quickly became a scandal throughout Massachusetts. This time, there were no vague accusations of evil spirits, just hard, gruesome evidence. Prudence was hanged on March 15, 1697. Even on her deathbed, she remained unrepentant. Her final words were deafening. "The work of purification will not cease. There are those who know that purification is necessary." Her house burned down soon after, but the psychological scars remained. The community was faced with a painful truth: evil can disguise itself as virtue, using the highest beliefs to destroy. The case files were sealed for 3 centuries. Prudence Fairweather's name was erased from official records, and so the memory that should have been a wake-up call turned into a blank in history. This story makes us wonder, have all the secrets about Prudence Fairweather really been revealed? Or are there still dark depths that no one has touched? Leave your thoughts in the comments section. If you are fascinated by these creepy mysteries, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next horror stories. See you in the next video.